They called my rifle a toy, a joke, a civilian hunting piece that had no place in real combat. They said it belonged in the quiet forests back home, not in the steaming jungles of the Pacific where men vanished without a sound. They laughed when they saw the scope. They laughed when they worked the bolt and felt how light the trigger was. And they laughed even harder when they found out I had paid for it myself before the war ever began. But they stopped laughing when the trees started firing back. My name is John George, and before this war was over, that toy rifle would change how my battalion moved, fought, and stayed alive. When we arrived on Guadalcanal in late 1942, the island already felt cursed. The Marines had taken Henderson Field, but the jungle beyond it still belonged to the enemy. The air never cooled, the ground never dried, insects covered everything, and death came without warning, always from above. You never heard the sniper first. You heard the sound a body made when it hit the ground. A man bending over, a man lifting supplies, a man stepping one pace too far into the open. Then silence again. In just 72 hours, we lost 14 men that way. 14. No firefights, no warning, just quick cracks in the distance and bodies on the jungle floor. We started moving like hunted animals, bent over, whispering, afraid of the sky. And through all of that, my rifle stayed in its case, treated like a joke no one wanted to tell anymore. I had ordered that rifle long before the war, a Winchester Model 70 with a civilian scope. I saved my National Guard pay for it. When it arrived at camp, the armorer asked me what I planned to hunt with it. I told him the truth, the Japanese. He shook his head and said the Army didn't issue sporting goods for combat. When I brought it to Guadalcanal, my captain ordered me to leave it in the tent. He told me the Garand was the only rifle that mattered. 8 rounds, semi-automatic, real firepower. I carried my Winchester anyway, not out of rebellion, out of certainty. I trusted that rifle more than anything the Army had issued me. For weeks, I never fired a shot in anger. Then, on the night of January 21st, everything changed. Another patrol came back short a man. Another poncho-covered shape was carried through camp. The battalion commander finally sent for me. He didn't ask about confidence. He didn't ask about belief. He asked one simple question. Can that rifle of yours hit anything? I told him the truth. He gave me until morning. At dawn, on January 22nd, 1943, I crawled into the ruins of an abandoned Japanese bunker just after sunrise. The position overlooked the groves where the snipers hunted. I brought no spotter, no radio, only water, ammunition, and that rifle they didn't trust. For nearly 2 hours I saw nothing. Only shadows, leaves, the illusion of movement that the jungle creates when it wants you afraid. Sweat ran into my eyes. My legs burned from holding still. Then, at 9:17 in the morning, one branch moved against the wind. I adjusted the scope, slowed my breathing, and squeezed. The rifle kicked, the sound cracked, and a body fell through branches before striking the earth. Minutes later, I saw the second one moving too fast, panicked. I led the motion and fired again. Another body fell. 2 shots, 2 snipers. And for the first time since we landed, the forest felt smaller. By midday, I had fired only 5 rounds. 5 snipers were dead. The men who had mocked that rifle now stood behind me in silence. But the enemy was only beginning to understand what was happening. That afternoon, a bullet struck a sandbag inches from my head. Dirt exploded into my face. They had found me. That was the start of the hunt. They stopped moving in daylight. They worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 watchman. When I fired at one, the other searched for me. I learned to fire once and disappear. By the end of the first day, 5 were gone. By the end of the second, 8. By the end of the third, 11. 11 snipers in 4 days. The trees fell silent. But silence doesn't mean safety. Silence means the enemy is thinking. They changed how they moved, lower, slower, smarter. They stopped climbing high and started crawling through ferns and roots. They studied my timing, my angles, my habits. And one morning, they laid a trap. I fired at what I thought was another shooter, and the jungle erupted. Machine gun fire tore through the position I had just left. Mortars began walking toward me. They weren't guessing anymore. They knew how I fought, and now they were hunting me the same way. For the first time, I ran. Bullets shattered branches around my head. Dirt kicked up at my heels. I slid into a crater filled with water and mud and stayed under the surface with only my eyes exposed. I held the rifle above my head to keep the barrel dry as enemy voices passed just meters away. One slipped near the rim of the crater. I fired from the water. He fell backward without a sound. Then everything exploded again. I rolled out the far side and disappeared into the jungle. From that day on, nothing was routine. Every movement changed. Every position was new. Every shot had to be perfect. Because now they were afraid of the man behind the rifle. And fear makes men desperate. Not long after, Command asked me to do something different. They wanted me to teach others how to do what I was doing. They had gathered men who could shoot well on paper. I told them paper doesn't shoot back. They learned fast. I trained them in pairs, shooter and spotter. I taught them to read leaves, shadows, wind, sound. I taught them that patience kills more men than speed ever could. Within days, we had teams moving into the jungle, and the results were immediate. The enemy began losing men in places they believed were safe, and for the first time since the campaign began, our patrols started returning, intact. Then a bullet found me. It struck my shoulder without warning. The impact spun me off my feet and knocked the breath from my body. I remember hitting the ground and thinking only one thing. So, this is how it ends. But it didn't. Medics dragged me back under fire. The round had missed bone and artery by inches. I spent days in a hospital tent listening to Jungle Rain on canvas and wondering how many men were still out there because I wasn't. Before I fully healed, new orders came down. A new mission. A new war inside the war. I volunteered without hesitation. I was sent halfway around the world to join a unit that didn't officially exist. A unit that would one day be known as Merrill's Marauders. Long-range penetration, deep jungle, no supply lines, no safety net. Just movement, endurance, and combat every day. The jungle in Burma made Guadalcanal feel gentle by comparison. Mountains replaced beaches. Rivers replaced trails. Disease moved faster than the enemy. Men collapsed from exhaustion where they stood. And still, we moved forward. I carried my rifle through mud, rain, and darkness, sometimes for days without firing a single shot. When I did fire, it had to matter, and it always did. On one patrol, I watched enemy officers directing troops across a river at extreme range. I took one shot. The officer fell. The crossing collapsed. In another fight, a machine gun pinned an entire patrol to the ground. One round ended it. On another night, a sniper tried to track us through bamboo shadows. He never saw my position change. By the time the Burma campaign ended, the unit that entered it no longer existed in the same form. Disease took more men than bullets, and when it was over, those of us who survived returned to a different war entirely, one where the end was finally in sight. When I came home, people asked about battles, about kills, about numbers. I never talked about that. I talked about waiting, about lying still while insects crawled across my face, about listening to the jungle breathe while knowing someone was watching you breathe back. I wrote everything down, not as a story, but as a record. That record would one day become a book. Shots fired in anger, not as a legend, not as hero worship, just as truth. Years later, I would learn how many men that toy rifle had truly claimed during those first days in the trees. How many lives on our side had been saved because the enemy's eyes had gone dark. But those numbers never mattered to me the way the waiting did. The silence, the moments before the trigger, the understanding that somewhere beyond the scope was a man who would never know what happened. They once mocked my rifle. They laughed at it. They called it useless. By the time the jungle finally grew quiet, no one was laughing anymore. And history would reduce everything to a number. Not the fear, not the waiting, not the breathing, just the number. And that number would save more lives than it ever took.